We were just casual sex partners. Until I caught real feelings. A novel of marriage, desire, and the lies we tell ourselves. Part 1. The Silence After I Do. Danielle O'Brien had always believed that marriage was a conversation, one that never truly ended, even in silence. She was wrong. She sat at the Marble Island in their kitchen in suburban Denver, a city she had once called exciting and liberating, watching her husband Kevin make a protein shake at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. The blender screamed its high-pitched whine, the sound of a man who had stopped trying to make conversation years ago. Kevin moved through the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a checklist, not living a life. He was a project manager for a construction firm, gone by 5:15 every morning, home by 7 o'clock most evening, in bed by 9:30 without fail. And in that bed, in that narrow lane of matrimonial routine, Danielle lay awake night after night, wondering when the conversation had ended. She was 38 years old. And Aries, if you believed in such thing, and Danielle did, more than she cared to admit. She had married Kevin 8 years ago after meeting him through a mutual friend at a bar in Boulder. The first 3 years of their relationship had been electric. They couldn't keep their hands off each other. Weekend trips to Fort Collins, late-night drives through the mountains, his body pressed against hers in the darkness of his apartment. The passion was real. She remembered it like a photograph she kept in a locked drawer, Kevin's hands trembling as he unbuttoned her blouse on New Year's Eve, his breath warm against her neck, the way he looked at her like she was the most miraculous thing he'd ever held. But something had changed after the wedding. Not all at once, that was the cruelest part. It happened in increments so small she couldn't pinpoint the moment it started. His kisses grew shorter. His hands stayed at his sides. By the time they had their daughter Lily, now 5, the physical connection had eroded to something barely recognizable. The last time they had been truly intimate was 14 months ago. Danielle had initiated, slipping her hand under the covers while Lily slept in the next room. Kevin had responded, technically. He had performed his duties with the enthusiasm of a man changing a tire, competent, brief, and entirely without joy. 5 minutes. That was all. 5 minutes, and then he rolled over and said, "That was nice," as if they had just finished a pleasant dinner. Danielle had lain there in the dark, her body aching with a hollowness she couldn't name, and thought, "This is my life now." The thing about a dying marriage, Danielle had come to understand, was that it didn't die all at once. It died in pieces, in small surrenders, in the gradual accumulation of moments where you reached for someone and found nothing reaching back. It died in the textbooks Kevin stopped reading aloud to her at night, in the weekends he spent on the couch with his laptop instead of tangled up with her in bed. It died in the birthday he forgot 3 years ago, not the date itself, but the card, the small gesture, the acknowledgement that he had woken up that morning and thought about her first. He had remembered by evening. Too late. The moment had passed, and he had let it pass, and Danielle had pretended not to notice because noticing would have meant confronting the full weight of what was happening, and she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready for that. Kevin traveled for work constantly, 5-day stretches at construction sites in Wyoming, Oklahoma, Texas. He was gone more than he was home, and when he was home, he was exhausted. She understood that, logically. She did. The man worked himself to the bone to provide for their family. He was not a bad husband. He paid the mortgage on time. He remembered Lily's school plays. He sent her text messages during the day that said things like "thinking of you" and "can't wait to see you tonight." But a marriage couldn't survive on mortgage payments and "thinking of you" text. Not for Danielle. She was a woman of passions and contradiction, the kind who cried at sunsets and argued loudly about books she'd read and felt everything with an intensity that frightened some people. She needed to be seen, touched, wanted, not managed, not maintained, not tolerated. She needed to be the first thing on someone's mind when they woke up, not an item on a to-do list that got checked off and forgotten. She worked at Mountain Energy Partners, a mid-sized utility company headquartered in downtown Denver. She was good at her job, sharp, decisive, well-liked among her colleagues. Her direct supervisor was Jonathan Chen, the VP of Operations, a man 11 years her senior who had a reputation for being demanding but fair. He had promoted her to senior analyst 2 years ago, and she had always appreciated the professional respect he showed her. She never imagined, in any universe, that she would be the kind of woman who had an affair. She had opinions about infidelity. Strong ones. She thought cheaters were cowards, people who lacked the courage to either fix their marriages or leave them. She would never. She was better than that. Until the night of the KTV. Part 2, the night that changed everything. It was March, a cold, relentless March that had turned Denver streets into rivers of gray slush and left everyone at Mountain Energy Partners irritable and depleted. The company was celebrating the close of a successful quarter, and someone had organized a dinner followed by karaoke at a private room venue near Lodo, the city's historic district. Danielle had gone reluctantly. She wasn't a big drinker, but the office had a way of making her loosen up. She sat at a corner table with a few colleagues from accounting, Beth, a woman in her 50s with 3 adult children and a perpetual air of exhaustion, and Marcus, a younger guy who had joined the company the previous summer and still approached every work event like a networking opportunity. They laughed at each other's jokes, at the spectacle of middle-aged managers murdering abathons, at the free-flowing wine that seemed to lubricate every social interaction in the room. The wine was flowing freely, and by 10:30 p.m., Danielle was feeling something she hadn't felt in months, light, unburdened, almost giddy. She caught herself laughing at something Beth said, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, and for a moment she felt like the woman she used to be. The woman who laughed easily. The woman who felt things without immediately cataloging them as symptoms of some deeper problem. She was 3 glasses of Pinot Noir deep when she noticed Jonathan across the room. He was holding court with the senior leadership team, a group that included the CFO, the head of HR, and 2 board members she rarely saw outside of all-hands meetings. Jonathan's laugh was deep and easy, the kind of laugh that made people turn their heads. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that suggested authority rather than age. He wore his authority like a coat he had owned for a decade, perfectly broken in. His sleeves were rolled up. His tie was loosened. He looked, Danielle thought, like a man who had figured out how to enjoy his own life without asking anyone's permission. He was married, everyone knew that. His wife, Catherine, was pregnant with their 2nd child. They had a son, Aiden, who was 4. Catherine worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado. Danielle had met her once at a company picnic 2 summers ago, a warm, round-faced woman with an easy smile and the particular patience of someone who spent their days caring for sick children. They had talked about books. Catherine recommended something Danielle never read. That was the sum total of their relationship. Danielle had never thought about Jonathan in any capacity beyond the professional. He was her boss. He signed her performance reviews. He was 11 years older and married and completely off limits in every conceivable way. But on that night, something shifted. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it happened. Later, she would try, replaying the evening in her mind like a film reel, searching for the precise frame where everything changed. She would never find it. It was more like a line that had been blurred for so long it simply ceased to exist. The dinner party thinned out gradually. People excused themselves with the weary efficiency of parents with young children. Beth left first, then Marcus, then most of the accounting team. By 11:15, the private room held only a handful of people: Danielle, Jonathan, two associates from the marketing team who were too drunk to notice anything beyond their own conversation, and a senior accountant named Phil who had long since passed out on a leather sofa, his snores providing a low, rhythmic bass line to the room. Danielle was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but the kind of drunk that made the room feel softer. The edges blurred, her inhibitions dissolved like sugar in hot water. She was sitting on the edge of a sectional sofa, her heels kicked off somewhere under the coffee table, her blazer discarded on a chair across the room. She felt loose in a way she hadn't felt in years, limbs heavy, mind quiet, the constant low-grade anxiety that had been her companion for as long as she could remember finally switched off. Jonathan appeared beside her with a glass of water. "You've had a lot tonight," he said. His voice was low, careful, the way a doctor delivers news. "I've had exactly the right amount," she said, and smiled. It was a real smile, the first real smile she could remember giving in weeks. "You should slow down," he said. "Last thing either of us needs is a scene. Relax, Jonathan." She reached out and touched his arm, casually, the way she might touch a colleague's arm during a meeting to make a point. But her hand lingered there, and she felt the warmth of his bicep through the fabric of his shirt, and something in her chest shifted like a door opening onto a room she didn't recognize. "I'm a big girl." "I know you are." He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he sat down beside her, closer than he needed to, and the warmth of his body beside hers was like a match struck in a dark room. They talked. She couldn't remember, afterward, what about, something about the quarterly report, probably, or the frustrating logistics of the new compliance software the company had implemented. Their conversations at work were always about this kind of thing: processes, deadlines, performance metrics. But sitting here, in the blue-purple glow of the KTD screensaver, with Phyllis snoring on the sofa and the wine burning in her bloodstream, the conversation felt different. It felt like the kind of talking that actually meant something. "You're always so composed at work," Jonathan said. "I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" "Loose. Relaxed. Like an actual person instead of a professional." Danielle laughed. "Maybe I needed a few glasses of wine to become an actual person. Maybe you need more than that." "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up the remote control from the coffee table and turned it over in his hands, saying it like it contained something important. The silence between them felt weighted, not awkward, but heavy with possibility, the way a room feels heavy before a thunderstorm. "I've watched you for 2 years," he said finally. "In meetings, in the hallway, at company events. You walk around this office like someone carrying a weight you can't set down. Like someone who's smiling on the outside and screaming on the inside." He looked at her. "I recognize it because I've been doing the same thing." Danielle felt something crack open in her chest, a hairline fracture in a wall she hadn't realized she'd built. "You seem fine. Most people seem fine. It's the baseline requirement for functioning in corporate America." Another laugh, but this one was softer, more vulnerable. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she said. "I don't know why I came tonight. I don't usually do this." "Do what?" "Any of it. Stay out late. Drink too much. Sit in a KTV room at midnight with my boss and talk about feelings like we're in some kind of therapy session." Jonathan smiled. It was a different kind of smile than the one she saw at work, less practiced, less contained. "I don't think this is a therapy session. If it were, I'd be charging you $400 an hour. You wish." The moment hung there, suspended in the blue-purple glow. Danielle could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, suddenly, impossibly loud, as if someone had turned up the volume on her own body. She was aware of everything, the warmth radiating from Jonathan's arm, which was resting on the back of the sofa just inches from her shoulders. The smell of his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that she had never noticed before, or had noticed and deliberately ignored. The way the light caught the silver in his hair and turned it to something almost beautiful. She should have stood up. She should have gone to the bathroom, called a ride chair, gone home to Kevin and Lily and the life she had built. She should have done a lot of things. Instead, she leaned back on the sofa, tilted her head toward the ceiling, and closed her eyes. "I can't remember the last time I felt like this," she murmured. "Like what?" "Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Even though I know I'm not." She felt him shift beside her. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her, not the way a boss looks at an employee, not the way a colleague looks at a peer, but the way a man looks at a woman when he is considering doing something dangerous and knows it and is doing it anyway. "Danielle," he said quietly. And just her name, spoken in that voice, in that tone, was enough to undo something she had spent years carefully tying together. She didn't know, in that moment, if the kiss was his idea or hers. Later, she would replay it in her mind hundreds of times, searching for the exact instant when the line had been crossed. She would never find it. It was more like a line that had been blurred for so long it simply ceased to exist. One moment they were talking about the quarterly report. The next moment his hand was on her cheek, and his lips were against hers, and the world fell out from under her like a floor that had been rotten all along. She kissed him back. That was the thing that terrified her most, later. She kissed him back with an urgency she had forgotten she was capable of. Her fingers dug into his shoulder. His hand slid into her hair. Somewhere in the room, someone laughed at something, a burst of sound from the marketing team that had nothing to do with them, but neither of them noticed. The entire universe had contracted to this sofa, this moment, this collision between two people who had spent years pretending they were fine and had finally, in the dark of a March night, stopped pretending. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Danielle looked at Jonathan and saw something in his face she recognized. It was the same hunger she felt every night lying next to Kevin, loneliness wearing the mask of desire. It was the face of someone who had everything and was still starving. "This isn't," she started. "No," he said. "It isn't." But neither of them moved. Part 3. The first night. The details of that night existed in Danielle's memory as a series of fragmented impressions, like photographs scattered across a table. Jonathan's hand on her knee in the wheelchair, his touch light but deliberate, a question he wasn't asking aloud. The taste of wine on his lips when he kissed her again in the elevator of her building, a brief, intense kiss that ended when the doors opened onto her floor and they pulled apart like two people who had just remembered something important. The way he said her name, Danielle, as if it were a word in a language he was relearning after years of disuse. They didn't have sex that night. That came later. What happened in her apartment was more fundamental than sex. It was an awakening. Her apartment was dark when they entered, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the half-drawn blinds. Danielle stood by the door and watched Jonathan take it in, the shoes by the entryway, the framed photograph of Lily on the hallway table, the general order of a home that was functional but no longer loved. He didn't comment on any of it. He just looked at her. "I should go," he said. But he didn't move toward the door. I know. She didn't move toward him either. They stood there in the dark, in the narrow space between the door and the living room, suspended in the gravity of what was about to happen. She could feel the heat of his body from 3 feet away. She could hear him breathing. "Tell me to go," he said quietly. "And I will." Danielle opened her mouth. She had the words. She could feel them right there, ready to be spoken. All she had to do was say them. Tell him to leave. Tell him this was a mistake. Tell him they were both adults with marriages and careers and a shared professional reputation that this would endanger. But the words wouldn't come. "Come here," she said instead. Jonathan touched her like she was something precious and dangerous at the same time. He took his time, more time than she had expected, more time than Kevin had ever taken with her in the entirety of their marriage. He undressed her slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving hers. He kissed her neck, her collarbone, the hollow behind her ear. He ran his hands along her sides, her hips, the curve of her waist, napping her body with a patience that felt almost archaeological, like a man who had been lost in a desert for years and had just discovered an oasis and was afraid that if he drank too fast he would choke. Her body responded to him in ways it had never responded to Kevin, not just physically, though that was overwhelming too, but in some deeper register, some cellular recognition of being finally, fully seen. She arched her back when he kissed her stomach. She gasped when his teeth grazed her nipple. She tangled her fingers in his hair and pulled him up to her mouth because she needed to kiss him again, needed to taste him, needed to confirm that this was real and not some elaborate dream her body had manufactured to punish her for years of silent suffering. When he finally entered her, she gasped, not from the physical sensation, but that was overwhelming, but from the sheer relief of being wanted again, of matting to someone who saw her. It was 15 minutes. Jonathan was not a young man, and he had been carrying tension for weeks. She could feel it in the controlled precision of his movements, the way he held himself just barely in check. But those 15 minutes contained more genuine passion than Danielle had experienced in the entirety of her marriage. She came, not just physically, though that too, her body trembling against his, but in some other way that was harder to name. She came to the realization that her body was not broken, not old, not past its prime. She came to the understanding that her hunger was not a character flaw or a symptom of some deeper psychological instability. She was just a woman who had been starving, and she had finally been fed. Afterward, Jonathan lay beside her in the dark, one arm draped across her stomach, and lit a cigarette. Danielle didn't smoke. She had never smoked, but she took it when he offered, and the first drag burned her throat and made her cough and sloat, and that moment, like the most adult thing she had ever done. "I should go," Jonathan said after a while. The clock on her nightstand read 1:47 a.m. Catherine will wonder. "I know," Danielle said. But neither of them moved. She lay there watching the ember of his cigarette pulse with each breath, a small red heartbeat in the dark, and thought about what she had just done. What she had just allowed to happen. The life she had just detonated. But the guilt didn't come. What came instead was something stranger and more alarming: peace. The kind of peace that follows a fever, a cleansing, a letting go. She felt lighter than she had felt in years. Her body hummed with a quiet, satisfied energy. She looked at the man beside her, this married man, this stranger, this person she had known only as a voice in conference rooms and a signature on her quarterly reviews, and felt something loosen in her chest, like a knot that had been tied so tightly for so long she had forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. She watched him get dressed. Watched him tuck his shirt into his pants, button his collar, straighten his tie. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had just done something he shouldn't have and was trying to reassemble his professional persona before re-entering the world. He paused at the door and looked back at her, still lying in bed, the sheet pulled up to her waist, her hair spread across the pillow like something from a painting she would never hang on a wall. "Are you okay?" he asked. She considered the question. It was, she realized, the first time anyone had asked her that in months. Not in those words, not "are you okay," like a concerned friend checking in, but in a real sense, the sense that implied a genuine desire to know the answer. "No," she said. "But I think I might be." He smiled, that smile, the one she was going to spend the next several months trying and failing not to fall in love with. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and Danielle was alone in her apartment with the smell of his cologne on her sheet and a feeling in her chest that felt terrifyingly like hope. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through every scenario she could think of, the best case, the worst case, and the infinite gray variations in between. In the best case scenario, this was a one-time mistake, a drunken aberration that would be quietly forgotten. She would see Jonathan at work on Monday and they would exchange the brief, professional nods of two people with a shared secret, and the secret would fade and life would go on. In the worst-case scenario, this would become a pattern, an addiction, a slow-motion catastrophe that would destroy her marriage, her career, her relationship with her daughter, her sense of self. She thought about Kevin, asleep in the house in Highlands Ranch. She thought about Lily's face when she dropped her off at preschool on Monday morning, the way Lily always looked back at her through the glass door, one small hand pressed flat against it, as if making sure her mother was still there. She thought about the mortgage and a retirement account and a carefully constructed life that looked, from the outside, like success. She thought about Jonathan. The way he had looked at her. The way he had touched her. The way he had asked her if she was okay, and the way he had waited for an honest answer. By 4 a.m., she had decided 3 things. First, this could never happen again. Second, she would not, under any circumstances, tell anyone what had happened, not a therapist, not a friend, not even the notebook she kept in the drawer of her nightstand. Third, she would treat this as what it was, a singular night when she had been drunk and vulnerable and had made a choice she wouldn't repeat. She would prove to herself that she was stronger than this. She lasted 4 days. Part 4, the arrangement. The second time was in his office after hours on a Thursday. Danielle had gone to his office to discuss a report. Specifically, she had chosen to go to his office to discuss a report, and she had chosen the time carefully, late enough that most of the floor would be empty, early enough that it wouldn't look suspicious. She realized even as she knocked on his door, already halfway to him in her intentions. She had been thinking about him constantly since Saturday night. She had caught herself replaying the kiss in the KTV room, the way his mouth had felt against her, at least a dozen times during the work week. She had looked for him in the hallways, in meetings, in the cafeteria at lunch. She had found herself studying his hands when he gestured during presentations, remembering what those hands had done to her body, and she had hated herself for it. She was not the kind of woman who did this. She was not. But she knocked on his door anyway. "Come in." She closed the door behind her. The office was dim, the overhead lights off, only the desk lamp casting a warm amber glow. Jonathan was sitting behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when she entered, and his expression changed in a way she could see even through the glasses, a slight widening of the eyes, a softening around the jaw. Recognition. He remembered. "Danielle," he said. "The report?" "The report," she confirmed. She closed the door behind her. They didn't talk about the report for another 10 minutes. What happened instead was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Jonathan standing up from his desk, crossing the room, and kissing her with a hunger that was entirely different from Saturday night. This was not the tender, exploratory kiss of two strangers learning each other for the first time. This was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about her as obsessively as she had been thinking about him, who had spent the last 4 days in the particular torture of wanting something he had promised himself he wouldn't want again. He pressed her against the door of his office. His hands were in her hair, on her waist, on the curve of her hips. She could feel him through his slack, hard against her, and the sensation was so startling and so intoxicating that she gasped into his mouth and dug her fingernails into his shoulders and thought, "I am going to destroy my life and I cannot bring myself to care." The sex in his office was nothing like the sex in her apartment. It was urgent, desperate, almost violent in its intensity, the sex of two people who knew they were doing something wrong and were using that knowledge as fuel. He bent her over his desk, scattering papers, knocking his water glass onto the carpet with a thud she barely registered. He entered her from behind, one hand on her hip, the other gripping the back of her neck, and she made sounds she had never made before, low, guttural sounds that came from somewhere primal and undefended. She came harder than she had on Saturday night. Harder than she had in years. She came with a cry that she muffled against her own arm because the walls of this office were thin and she had not yet completely abandoned her grip on reality. When it was over, she lay across his desk, her cheek pressed against the cool surface, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and thought, "This is who I am now. This is who I am." They didn't speak for a long time. Jonathan wrote of himself, zipped up, and returned to his desk chair as if returning to a meeting. He handed her a tissue from the box on his desk, and she used it, and neither of them laughed, and neither of them apologized. "The report," Jonathan said finally, gesturing to the papers scattered across the floor. "You had questions." "I did. We should probably address them." "Probably." Neither of them moved. Danielle was still lying on the desk, her skirt bunched around her waist, her blouse untucked, her hair a disaster. Jonathan was sitting 3 feet away, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts desire and calculation, the look of a man who had just done something reckless and was already thinking about the professional implications. "We can't do this here," he said. "I know. At least not often. Someone could see. Someone could hear. I know. We need to be careful. I know." She sat up, pulled down her skirt, and began rebuttoning her blouse with fingers that still trembled. "I know all of this. I'm not stupid. I didn't say you were stupid." He paused. "I said we need to be careful." She looked at him, really looked at him, in the amber lamplight of his office, surrounded by the debris of their mutual transgression. He was 51 years old. He had gray in his hair and lines around his eyes and a small scar on his chin she had never noticed before. He was, she thought, one of the most ordinary-looking men she had ever slept with. And yet, "What are we doing?" she asked. "I don't know. I don't think either of us planned this. That's not what I mean. I mean, what are we doing? Is there a plan? An arrangement? Are we going to pretend this never happened and go back to quarterly reports and performance reviews?" Jonathan took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I can't do that." He looked at her. "But I'm also not going to blow up my life. I have 2 kids, Danielle. A wife. A career that I've spent 25 years building. I can't just... I know. She stood up and straightened her skirt. I'm not asking you to blow anything up. I'm just asking you to tell me what we're doing. Because if we're going to keep doing this, and I think we both know we are, then I need to know what the rules are. I need to know where the boundaries are. I can't do this in a gray zone. I don't function well in gray zones. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a tired, rueful smile that made him look older and more human than she had ever seen him. You're very organized for a woman who just had sex on my desk. I'm a project manager's wife. I know how to manage projects. The third time was in a hotel room near the airport, a place with thick curtains and a do not disturb sign that felt like a passport to another life. The room smelled of industrial detergent and synthetic lavender, the olfactory signature of every mid-range hotel in America, and Danielle had never felt more exotic than she did walking through that door on Jonathan's arm. They had an hour. That was what he had told her. His meeting had run long. Catherine was picking up Aiden from swim practice. He had exactly 1 hour before he needed to be somewhere else performing the role of devoted husband. Danielle had listened to this logistics briefing with half an ear, the other half still reeling from the fact that this was her life now, a woman who checked into hotels near the airport for stolen hours with her married boss. The hour, when it came, was different from the first 2 times. Slower. More deliberate. As if they had both agreed, wordlessly, to treat this as a rehearsal for something more sustainable, a dry run for a life they couldn't yet have but were beginning to imagine. Jonathan kissed her the way he had kissed her on Saturday night, tenderly, thoroughly, with his hands cradling her face like she was something fragile and extraordinary. He undressed her in the gray afternoon light that filtered through the thick curtains and laid her on the hotel bed and looked at her for a long time without touching her. "You're beautiful," he said. It was not a compliment designed to flatter. It was an observation made with the clinical precision of a man who noticed things. "I don't think I've told you that." "You haven't." "I should have." "You were a little busy." He smiled, a real smile, warm and crooked and entirely unlike the expression she saw on his face in the fluorescent-lit conference rooms of Mountain Energy Partners. "I noticed," he said. "Every time you walked into a room, I noticed." By the end of the first month, Danielle had lost count. She told herself it was simple. It was just sex. A transaction between 2 adults who were getting something they needed and weren't getting elsewhere. She had needs. Jonathan had needs. Neither of them was hurting anyone, or so she reasoned, the logic sounding thinner each week. She watched herself carefully for signs of attachment, and finding none, pronounced herself immune. She was a modern woman. She understood the distinction between physical pleasure and emotional entanglement. She had read the articles, the think pieces about the situationship and the FWB. She was educated, self-aware, in control. She knew the rules of engagement for this kind of arrangement, and she would not violate them. Jonathan, for his part, made no pretense of romance. He did not send her flowers or write her notes. Their conversations were functional and direct, where, when, how long. He was, as she came to understand him, a man who had made a careful analysis of his own life and decided that certain needs would be met outside the boundaries of his marriage, quietly, without disruption. He was not looking for love. He was looking for relief. He had a life that worked. On paper, a wife, children, a career, a house in Cherry Creek with a view of the mountains, and he was not interested in dismantling it. He was simply interested in patching the leak. Danielle could provide that. She was, as she privately acknowledged, very good at it. She began to think of herself as a connoisseur rather than a participant, a woman who had developed an expertise in a very specific and unusual domain. She told herself she was not emotionally invested. She had analyzed the situation from every angle and concluded that Jonathan was not her type. He was too old, too conventional. His jokes were formulaic and his taste in music was conservative. He was, in every meaningful way, Kevin's opposite, and that, she told herself, was precisely why it worked. There was no romantic confusion, no dangerous overlap. Just friction, chemistry, release. She began to take pride in the arrangement. She was not destroying anyone's family. She was not in love. She was simply a woman who had found an efficient solution to an otherwise intractable problem. Her marriage was intact. Her family was intact. And she was finally getting what she needed in bed. She started buying new lingerie, lace and silk and dark colors, things Kevin had never seen. She began moisturizing her body with obsessive regularity, paying attention to details she had long neglected. She was investing in herself, she reasoned. Not in him. Never in him. Part 5. The Creep of Feeling. The problem with telling yourself you don't have feelings is that feelings have no regard for self-awareness. Danielle began to notice changes in herself that she could not explain away with logic. She found herself thinking about Jonathan during work hours, not in a sexual way, but in a softer, more dangerous way. She wondered what he was doing in meetings she wasn't part of. She noticed when he was stressed, a tightness around his jaw, a tendency to check his phone more frequently, and found herself wanting to comfort him. Not in the way she would comfort a colleague, but in the way she once would have comforted a lover, with her hands, her mouth, her full and undivided attention. She caught herself looking at photographs of him on the company internet, formal headshots, stiff and corporate, and studying them with an intensity that had nothing to do with professional curiosity. She noticed the exact shade of brown in his eyes. The way his smile didn't quite reach them. The small scar on his chin that he never explained. She wondered about his childhood, his college years, the woman he had been before he became the polished, composed executive who ran meetings and signed off on budgets and delivered quarterly projections with the calm confidence of a man who had never doubted his own authority. She wanted to know what made him laugh when he was alone. She wanted to know what he thought about at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep. She wanted to know everything, and the wanting was so sharp and so specific that it frightened her. One afternoon, sitting in a departmental meeting, she watched Jonathan present the quarterly numbers to a room of 30 people and felt something twist in her chest, not arousal, not admiration, but something more tender and far more terrifying. She wanted to reach across the table and touch his hand. She wanted to be the person who knew what he was thinking when the numbers disappointed him. She wanted to be the one he called at 6 p.m. to say, "Rough day, need you." She realized with a cold shock, falling in love with him. No. Absolutely not. She stamped on the thought like a cigarette butt. This was not part of the agreement. This was not the plan. She had been explicit with herself about the boundaries of this arrangement, and she would not, could not, cross them. Jonathan was a sexual convenience. Nothing more. She refused to let her biological impulses override her intellectual clarity. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed, pregnant at every meal, every conversation, every quiet moment. She started to crave his presence the way a person craves a drug, not for the high, but for the absence of the low that came when it wore off. She found herself inventing reasons to text him. A question about a report. A comment on a meeting she hadn't attended. He responded with professional brevity, and each terse reply felt like a small wound. This is absurd, she told herself. You are a 38-year-old woman with a master's degree and a child and a mortgage. You are not going to fall apart over a man you see twice a week for sex. She doubled down on her self-discipline. She read articles about attachment and emotional regulation. She went for long runs along the Platte River, pushing her body until her lungs burned and her mind went quiet. She started writing again, a journal, really, unsent letters to no one in which she tried to articulate the strange and terrible experience of wanting something she had explicitly refused to want. The journal entries grew longer, more desperate, more honest. Asterisk, I don't know how this happened. I had rules. I had boundaries. I had a system. And now I'm lying here thinking about the way he said my name the first time, like he was tasting a word he'd been waiting to say. I'm thinking about the scar on his chin and wondering how you got it. I'm thinking about what he looks like when he sleeps asterisk. This is not what I signed up for. Asterisk, last night Kevin rolled over in bed and put his hand on my hip and I flinched. Not because I don't love him, I do, or I did, or I thought I did, but because Kevin's touch feels like a habit now and Jonathan's touch feels like a revelation. Every time Jonathan touches me, it's like the first time. The air clears. The noise stops. I am, for the first time in years, completely present in my own body, asterisk. Asterisk, is this what I've been missing? Or is this just the thrill of the forbidden? If I were with Jonathan every day, would the novelty wear off the way it wore off with Kevin? Am I in love with him, or am I in love with the way he makes me feel about myself? Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't know. And that not knowing is going to drive me crazy, asterisk. The first time he said, "But I love you," Danielle laughed. They were in her apartment on a Saturday afternoon, the curtains drawn, the city reduced to a dull murmur outside. The sex had been different that day. Jonathan had been particularly aggressive, almost desperate, his usual composure cracked by something he refused to name. There had been a work event the night before, a dinner for the board that Jonathan had been required to attend alone, and Danielle had spent the entire evening imagining him at that table with Catherine on one side and the CEO on the other, performing the role of happily married man, and she had felt something she refused to name, jealousy. Real, corrosive, completely irrational jealousy. The kind of jealousy that belonged to women who were in love, not women who were in situationships. Afterward, lying in the tangle of sheets, Jonathan turned to her and said, very quietly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Danielle stared at the ceiling. Her heart was doing something strange and arrhythmic in her chest, like a bird trapped in a cage. "You can't be serious. I'm not asking you to say it back." "Good," she said. "Because I don't." She felt him nod beside her. "I know. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" A long pause. Outside, a siren wailed past, the sound of someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis. "I don't know," he said. "Something I can't control." Danielle sat up and reached for her cigarettes. Yes, she had started smoking regularly now, a habit she attributed to stress and the particular chemistry of her situation, not to any emotional attachment to Jonathan or the life she was building around him. She lit one and exhaled a long stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "We're not doing this," she said. "We're not turning into one of those couples. We have a good thing. A clean thing. Don't ruin it." "I haven't ruined anything." "Then don't start." He didn't say it again. Not for a while. But Danielle heard the words in silence, in the way he held her a few seconds longer than usual when they were done, in the way he sometimes looked at her across the conference table during meetings with an expression she couldn't decode. She heard the words in every text message he sent, even the purely logistical ones, and she hated herself for hearing them, for reading significance into logistics, for turning a perfectly functional sexual arrangement into a soap opera of her own devising. She was better than this. She was. She kept telling herself that until she wasn't. Part 6. The Spiral. The breaking point came on a Sunday in June, 6 months after the KTV night. Jonathan had cancelled their plans, the first time in their entire arrangement. Something had come up with Catherine, he said. A prenatal complication. A trip to the hospital. Danielle understood, rationally. Of course she understood. His wife was pregnant. His family came first. That was the arrangement, the very foundation on which their entire illicit structure rested. But the cancellation sent her into a spiral she hadn't anticipated. She spent the entire day in a state of low-grade hysteria, oscillating between rage and despair, unable to concentrate on anything. She cleaned the kitchen cabinets at 10 a.m., taking everything out and putting it back in a different configuration that served no purpose whatsoever. She alphabetized Lily's bookshelf at noon, a project that took 2 hours and resulted in no meaningful change to the organization of a shelf that a 5-year-old would dismantle in 30 seconds anyway. At 3 p.m., she sat in her car in the driveway, unable to go inside, unable to go anywhere, just sitting with her hands on the wheel and a scream building in her throat. Kevin was inside, probably watching football with the sound off because he knew she didn't like it, being considerate in the particular way of a man who had forgotten how to be inconsiderate because he had stopped caring enough to try. Lily was at a birthday party. The house was quiet, and Danielle sat in her car and felt the walls of her life closing in on her with the slow, inexorable pressure of a coffin lid. She called Jonathan. She never called him. They communicated exclusively through an encrypted messaging app, and even then, only sparingly, coordinate, logistic, the spare language of a clandestine arrangement. "Where are you?" she asked when he answered. Her voice sounded strange to her, thin, high, unrecognizable. "At the hospital." "I told you." "Catherine." "I know. I know. She stopped. What? Needed to hear his voice? Needed to confirm he still existed, still wanted her, still thought about her even when he was tending to his real family? "Are you okay?" he asked. There was something in his voice, concern, yes, but also a wariness that hadn't been there before. "No," she said. "I'm not." A long silence. The sound of a hospital corridor in the background, rolling carts, distant voices, the ambient hum of fluorescent lights, and institutional anxiety. Someone laughed, far away. The mundanity of it struck her like a physical blow, even in a hospital corridor, even on a Sunday afternoon with his pregnant wife in a room down the hall. Jonathan was willing to answer the phone for her. "Danielle, I need to see you." "I can't." "Not tonight." "Then when?" A pause. "Tomorrow's. After work. The usual place." "Okay." She hung up without saying goodbye. She sat in the car for another 20 minutes, watching the light change over the Rocky Mountains to the west, the sky going through its slow technical or collapse from blue to orange to deep, bruised purple. She thought about what she was doing, who she was becoming. The kind of woman who calls her married lover on a Sunday because he canceled a fuck. "This is it," she thought. "This is the moment I become someone I don't recognize." But she didn't call it off. She didn't end it. She drove inside, made dinner for Kevin and Lily, helped Lily with her homework, kissed her daughter goodnight, and lay awake until 3 a.m. thinking about Jonathan's voice on the phone and the weariness in it. The next day, in his office, Danielle didn't wait for small talk. "You need to understand something," she said, standing by the window with the Denver skyline behind her. the afternoon light catching the dust motes in the air like tiny, indifferent witnesses. She had rehearsed this conversation 17 times in her head since leaving the hospital parking lot. 17 different versions, each more controlled than the last. I am not in love with you. Jonathan looked up from his desk. He had the weary look of a man who had not slept well. Okay. I'm telling you this because I need you to hear it. What we have is good. It's clean. It's exactly what I need. But I need you to stop saying things like you love me, because I don't know what to do with that, and I won't have it destabilizing a situation that's working. What exactly are you afraid of? He asked. His tone was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades in corporate environments where emotional outbreaks were liabilities to be managed. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm clarifying terms. Those aren't the same thing. They are to me. Jonathan stood and walked to the window, standing beside her but not quite touching her. They were close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that she had come to associate with a specific and irreplaceable feeling of safety. Outside, the city sprawled beneath them, full of people living their complicated, ordinary lives, none of whom knew what was happening in this room. Danielle, he said. I'm not trying to complicate this. Then don't. I'm not going to apologize for what I feel. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to keep it to yourself. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were exactly as she remembered, dark, deep, unreadable. But there was something else there now, something that looked like hurt, and the sight of it made her chest ache with a sharp, specific pain, like a rib cracked from coughing. Why does it scare you so much? He asked. Because I'm married. You're not in love with your husband. That's not the point. Then what is the point? She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she had an answer, but it was too ugly to say out loud. The point was that if she admitted to loving Jonathan, she would have to confront the full scope of what she had done and what she was doing. She would have to admit that her marriage was a shell, that Kevin had been a placeholder for the life she thought she wanted, that she had settled so gradually and so thoroughly that she hadn't noticed the ground shifting beneath her until it was too late to plant her feet anywhere solid. She would have to admit that she had been hungry for a very long time, and that Jonathan was the first person who had bothered to feed her. She would have to admit that she was terrified, not of loving Jonathan, but of what it would mean to stop pretending she didn't. I'm not having this conversation, she said, and walked out. She lasted 4 days before she texted him. The message was short, a time, a place. He replied with a single word, yes. They met at the hotel near the airport. The one with the thick curtains and the do not disturb sign that had become, over 6 months, the closest thing she had to a second home. Jonathan was different that night. Quieter. More deliberate. He kissed her with an intensity that felt like an argument, a physical attempt to communicate something he didn't have the words for. He touched her with a tenderness that made her want to cry, which she did, quietly, while his mouth was on her neck so he wouldn't notice. But he noticed. He always noticed. You're crying, he said, pulling back. No, I'm not. Danielle. Don't. He lay down beside her and pulled her against his chest, his heartbeat steady and slow against her cheek. She should have pulled away. This was not the transaction they had agreed on. This was intimacy in the truest and most dangerous sense, emotional, vulnerable, without boundary or protection. This was the thing she had been so desperate to avoid. She didn't pull away. She pressed her face harder against his chest and let herself be held, and for a few minutes, she let herself imagine a different life, one in which Jonathan was not married, she was not married, and the logistics of their love were not a minefield requiring constant navigation. In that imagined life, they would wake up together every morning. They would argue about whose turn it was to make coffee. They would introduce each other at parties as their partner, their person, without the constant caveat, of complication, of the unspoken third parties who lurked in the background of every conversation. "I can't keep doing this," she said into his shirt. "Doing what?" "Acting like this is just sex. I can't." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You were right. About everything. I am scared. I'm terrified. Because if I let myself want this, really want it, I don't know how to go back to what my life was before." Jonathan was silent for a moment. Outside, a plane passed overhead, its landing lights blinking against the dark sky like slow, purposeful stars. "Then don't go back," he said. "It's not that simple." "I know. Nothing about this is simple." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that felt like a confession. "But I'm not going anywhere. I've told you how I feel. I meant it. Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow. And the day after." Danielle closed her eyes. She thought about Kevin, asleep in their bed in Highlands Ranch, trusting and oblivious. She thought about Lily, who had started asking why Mommy always seemed sad, a question Danielle had deflected with cheerful nonsense about being tired from work, a deflection so transparent and it made her wince even as she delivered it. She thought about Jonathan's wife Catherine, whose pregnancy was now in its 7th month, whose second child would arrive in the fall like a small, innocent grenade. She thought about the life she had built, careful, stable, sensible, and how it had been slowly draining the color from her for years, and how Jonathan had walked into her life like a lightning strike and illuminated every shadow she'd been living in. She opened her eyes. "I don't want to be the other woman. I hate that term. I hate what it implies." "Then what do you want to be?" "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." She sat up and reached for her cigarettes. Her hands were shaking. "But I know this isn't just sex for me. It hasn't been for a while. And pretending otherwise is making me crazy." Jonathan sat up beside her. He took the cigarette from her hand, took a drag, and handed it back. A gesture so small and ordinary it made her chest hurt. "I'm not going to ask you to leave your husband," he said. "I'm not going to ask you for anything. I just want you to know that when you're with me, when we're here, in this room, you don't have to pretend. Not with me. That makes that worse." "How?" "Because pretending is the only thing keeping me sane." Part 7, The Reckoning. The weeks that followed were the most emotionally volatile of Danielle's adult life. She oscillated between periods of false clarity, back to the gym, back to the journal, back to telling herself she had this under control, and episodes of profound despair that struck without warning, like migraines, leaving her unable to function. She went back to Kevin one night in a deliberate, almost clinical attempt to repair what was broken. She initiated sex for the first time in months, approaching it with the determined optimism of a woman attempting a home repair she had no skills for. She put on the new lingerie, the lace and silk she had bought for Jonathan, the garments that had become, in her mind, the uniform of her secret life, and she stood in the bedroom doorway and waited for Kevin to notice. He noticed. He looked up from his phone, registered the lingerie with a flicker of surprise that was almost insulting in its novelty, and said, "You look nice." That was all. "You look nice." Not "what's the occasion?" Not "God, you look incredible." Not any of the things Jonathan would have said, or had said, in the amber lamplight of his office or the anonymous safety of the hotel near the airport. Kevin set down his phone. He performed his duties with his usual polite competence. 5 minutes, a brief satisfied sigh, a turn away toward his side of the bed. Danielle lay in the dark, her body humming with a dissatisfaction so profound it felt almost philosophical, and thought, this is over. Whatever thread had connected her to Kevin's physical affection had finally and irrevocably snapped. The distance between them had always been emotional before. Now it was spatial, permanent, architectural. She looked at Kevin across the breakfast table and felt nothing, not anger, not guilt, not even sadness. Just a vast, flat numbness, like touching a limb that had fallen asleep. He was a kind man. A good father. He deserved better than the hollow, duplicitous shell she had become. She began to pull away from Jonathan as well, not out of resolve but out of fear. She canceled 3 consecutive meetings. She stopped responding to his messages for days at a time, then sent apologetic texts that she deleted before he could read them in full. She was acting erratically and she knew it, but she couldn't stop. She was standing at the edge of something and she didn't know if she was going to jump or step back, and the uncertainty was making her dizzy. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, a day in which she had sat across from Jonathan in a conference room and pretended, with the skill of a trained operative, that he was nothing more than a professional colleague, she broke. She called him at 11 p.m. from the bathroom of her own home, Kevin asleep down the hall. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "I can't keep acting like this is fine. I'm not fine. I haven't been fine for years. And you make me feel things I don't know how to feel for anyone except you. Danielle." "No, let me finish. I need to tell you this because if I don't say it out loud, I'm going to lose my mind. I love you. I am in love with you. And it has nothing to do with the sex, even though the sex it's extraordinary. But I love you. And that terrifies me more than anything has ever terrified me in my life." There was a long silence on the line. Then Jonathan said, very quietly, "I know." "How do you know?" "I didn't even know. I've known for a while. The way you look at me in meetings. The way you pull away when someone walks in. The way you hold on to me like you're afraid I'll disappear." A pause. "The way you say my name." Danielle pressed her forehead against the cool tile of the bathroom wall. The tile was cold and smooth and entirely indifferent to the crisis unfolding above it. "What do we do?" "I don't know," he said. "But I'd rather figure it out together than pretend we're fine alone." She laughed, a broken, exhausted sound. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple. Nothing about this is simple. But the alternative is losing you, and I'm not willing to do that. You might not have a choice. Eventually. Then I'll fight for what I want. For once in my life, I'll actually fight for something that matters." Danielle closed her eyes. In the dark of her bathroom, in a house that no longer felt like a home, in a marriage that had been dead for so long she'd forgotten what living felt like, she let herself believe him. Part 8, The Mirror. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not with Jonathan. It was with herself. Danielle sat in her car in a parking lot of a Starbucks in Cherry Creek, a notebook open on the passenger seat, a pen in her hand, and wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about Kevin, not the Kevin of today, but the Kevin she had married. The man who had looked at her like she was a miracle. The man who had made her laugh until her stomach hurt. The man who had held her hand in the hospital when her mother was dying and said, "I'm not going anywhere." She wrote about the Kevin who had proposed to her on a Tuesday night in his tiny apartment in Lakewood, fumbling with a ring box that cost 3 months of his salary because he wanted her to have something real, something beautiful, something that said, "I see you and I choose you and I am not going to change my mind." She wrote about the day she realized that man was gone, not dead, but gone, retreated into some interior distance she couldn't reach. She wrote about the years of silence that followed, the slow erosion of intimacy, the gradual disappearance of touch and eye contact, and the 1,000 small acts of love that hold a marriage together. She wrote about feeling invisible in her own home, and how that invisibility had become so complete that she had started to believe she deserved it. She wrote about Jonathan, the first kiss in the KTV room, the way his hands felt on her body, hands that touched her like she was worth touching, like her pleasure was not an afterthought but a purpose. The cigarette after. The slow, terrifying realization that someone was finally seeing her again, really seeing her, and the way that recognition had cracked her open like a seed that needed to be planted. She wrote about what she wanted, not what she should want, not what was correct or proper or expected, what she actually, desperately, embarrassingly wanted: to be chosen, to be desired, to wake up next to someone who couldn't keep their hands off her, to feel, for once in her adult life, like the most important thing in the world to someone. She wrote about Lily, how she was terrified of disrupting her daughter's life, of explaining something too complicated for a 5-year-old to understand, how she didn't want Lily to grow up thinking that passion was something to be suppressed, that desire was something to be ashamed of, that settling was the price of stability. She wanted her daughter to know that love was worth fighting for, real love, the kind that made you feel alive, even when it was dangerous. She wrote about fear, the paralyzing, indecisive, future-racing fear that kept her frozen at the edge of a life she couldn't bring herself to enter or leave. She was 40 years old. She had wasted the last decade being comfortable. She was running out of time to want something and actually go get it. She wrote about Jonathan's wife, Catherine. She imagined her, the morning sickness, the swollen feet, the way her hand rested on her belly when she felt the baby move. She imagined what it would be like to be Catherine, to be the woman who got to sleep beside Jonathan every night, to be the mother of his children, to be the person whose life was so complete it required no supplementation, no secret visits to airport hotels, no carefully managed infidelity. She hated Catherine with a pure and irrational hatred that startled her with its intensity, and then she hated herself for hating Catherine, because Catherine had done nothing wrong except exist in the life Danielle wanted. She closed the notebook. She drove home. She made dinner. She helped Lily build a Lego house, a structure that looked, when they were done, like nothing so much as a disaster, with crooked walls and a mything roof and a chimney that was actually a small Lego person standing on its head. Lily named it the best house ever, and Danielle didn't correct her. And the next morning, she called Jonathan. "I want to see you," she said. "Not at the hotel. Not at the office. I want to see you in the daylight, in the real world, where I can look at you without the theatrics of it. Okay. Not as my boss. Not as your employee. Just as us. Can we do that?" A pause. She could hear him thinking, the pause of a man who understood that what she was asking for was not a coffee date but a renegotiation of the entire framework of their relationship. "Yes," he said. "We can do that." They met at a coffee shop in Rhino, the arts district north of downtown, on a Saturday morning. Danielle wore jeans and a plain white t-shirt, no makeup, her hair pulled back. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had been through something, which she had. Jonathan was waiting at a table by the window, holding a cup of black coffee, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, still corporate, even on a Saturday, the man unable to fully shed his professional skin. But when he saw her, something in his face changed. It was subtle, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation at the jaw. The face of a man who was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy to see her. She sat down across from him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The coffee shop hummed around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversation, a Sufjan Stevens song playing quietly from the speakers. It was the most ordinary moment of their entire relationship. And the most extraordinary. "I don't know how to do this," Danielle said finally. "Neither do I. I don't want to hurt Lily. Neither do I. I don't know if I can actually leave Kevin. I'm terrified of appending everything. I have a life, a house, a retirement account, a planned trip to Disney World in the fall." Jonathan smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Disney World is important. I respect that. I'm serious. So am I. Disney World is a legitimate consideration. So is the rest of your life." He leaned forward. "Danielle, I'm not asking you to make a decision today. I'm asking you to stop pretending this isn't real. Stop running. Look at what's in front of you and decide what you actually want, not what you think you should want, not what's safe, but what you actually want." Danielle wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms. Through the window, she could see the street, people walking their dogs, a cyclist gliding past, a couple holding hands at a crosswalk. The entire mundane, miraculous parade of people living their complicated, imperfect lives. "I want to stop being afraid," she said quietly. "I want to stop apologizing for what I want. I want someone who looks at me the way you look at me. And I want," she stopped. The words were so simple and so enormous she could barely get them out. "I want to be happy. Real happiness. Not the kind where you're comfortable and safe and slowly dying inside. The kind where you feel it. Where it hurts because it's so real." Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand. Not a romantic gesture, not here, in public, where anyone could see. Just a hand on a hand, a human connection, an acknowledgement that cut through all the careful categories and convenient fictions they had constructed. "I hear you. I see you. You are not alone." "Then that's what you fight for," he said. Part 9, The Verdict. She left Kevin on a Thursday in September, 3 months after the conversation in the coffee shop. It was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no thrown dishes, no dramatic revelations delivered in the heat of an evening argument. It was quiet, considered, almost clinical, the way Danielle approached most things that terrified her. She sat Kevin down at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and told him, in clear and measured language, that she wanted a separation. She told him she had been unhappy for a long time, years, and that she had tried to address it, but could not do so while remaining in the marriage. She told him she loved him as a person and a partner but not as a spouse, and that she could not continue pretending otherwise. Kevin did not cry. He did not rage. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, and absorbed the information with the expression of a man receiving a diagnosis he had always suspected but hoped would never come. "How long?" he asked. Danielle hesitated. She had decided, after considerable deliberation, that partial honesty was better than complete dishonesty. "A while," she said. "Longer than I'm proud of." Kevin absorbed this, too. "Is there someone?" "Yes." Kevin looked at her for a long moment. She braced for the question she knew was coming, the next logical inquiry in the sequence, the one that would force her to choose between Jonathan's privacy and her own honesty. "Is it serious?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I always knew something was wrong. I didn't know how to fix it. I tried, Danielle. I know it didn't seem like it, but I tried. I know you did, she said, and meant it. The guilt rose in her throat like bile, but beneath it was something else, a vast, dizzying, almost guilty relief, like stepping out of a burning building into cool air. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell you sooner. I'm sorry I let it get this bad. Kevin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What about Lily? I'll always be there for her. That doesn't change. You and I can figure out the logistics. She needs both of us. Kevin nodded again. He looked so tired, so defeated, in the gentle and dignified way of a man who had given everything he had to something that was never going to work. She felt the guilt crest like a wave, but she didn't let it pull her under. She had spent too long drowning in other people's needs. She was not going back under now. She moved into a small apartment in Park Hill, a neighborhood in northeast Denver known for its old trees and quiet street and the kind of modest, well-maintained homes that suggested stability without pretension. She painted the walls a soft gray and bought a second-hand couch and hung curtains that weren't white. Jonathan came over on evenings when he didn't have his children, Aiden and the new baby, a girl named Sophie, born in October. He brought wine and takeout and an eagerness to help with the small projects that came with setting up a new home. He fixed a leaky faucet. He assembled a bookshelf. He learned which burner on the stove worked and which didn't, and he made a mental note to get it repaired. They did not have sex every time he came over. This was new and strange and deeply meaningful. They sat on the couch and watched movies and talked about things that had nothing to do with work or marriage or infidelity. She told him about her mother's death, the grief she had never fully processed, the way it had hollowed her out from the inside. He told her about his father, a stern and distant man who had died of a heart attack when Jonathan was 24, leaving a silence that Jonathan had spent his entire adult life trying to fill. They were learning each other in ways that had nothing to do with bodies, and it was terrifying and wonderful and nothing like the transactional arrangement Danielle had convinced herself this was in the beginning. One night, lying in her new bed in the new apartment, Jonathan beside her reading a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, Danielle said, I keep waiting to regret it. Regret what? Leaving Kevin. Choosing this. Choosing you. Jonathan set down the book. Do you? I don't know. I think about the life I had, the house, the stability, the future I was supposed to have, and I wonder if I threw it away for something that won't last. And what do you think? I think, she paused, searching for the truest answer she had. I think that life wasn't real. It was a simulation of a life. It looked like a life from the outside, mortgage, marriage, kid, dog, the whole American dream package, but inside I was just this empty space, waiting for someone to fill it. And now, she turned to look at him. In the lamplight, he looked older than he was, not aged, but deepened, like a landscape that had been worn into beauty by time. Now I feel like I'm finally in a life that's real. Even if it's messy. Even if I don't know how it's going to end. Jonathan leaned over and kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender and unremarkable it made her eyes sting. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. He pulled her close, and she let herself be held, and in the quiet of her small apartment on a quiet street in a city she had lived in for a decade but was only now beginning to know, Danielle O'Brien allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Fragile, irrational, terrifying hope, the kind that comes after you've destroyed everything you thought you needed and found, in the rubble, something that looks almost like yourself. Part 10. The New Life. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Danielle had to learn, painfully, incrementally, through a series of small failures and incremental successes, how to be a single mother. She had to explain to Lily, in carefully chosen words that were honest without being cruel, that Mommy's house and Daddy's house were different houses now, and that both houses had love in them, even if they were different kinds of love. Lily took this information with the matter-of-fact resilience of a 5-year-old, asked if there would be a backyard at Mommy's new house, and when Danielle said yes, declared the situation basically fine. She had to navigate the logistics of co-parenting with Kevin, the pickup schedule, the school conferences, the complicated dance of two people who had once shared a bed and now shared only the management of a small person's life. Kevin, to his credit, never made the transition harder than it needed to be. He was hurt and confused and angry in ways he didn't fully express, but he showed up. Every time. He picked Lily up on Wednesdays. He brought her back on Sundays with a new stuffed animal he had bought her at the airport because he still traveled constantly and still thought about her constantly and still loved her in the only way he knew how. Danielle had to learn to be alone, not just physically alone, in the quiet apartment with the gray walls and the second-hand couch, but emotionally alone, in the deep and unsettling way of a woman who had spent so many years defining herself by her relationships that she had forgotten she was a person with her own desires, her own opinions, her own taste in music and books, and the particular way she liked her coffee. She started reading again, not the parenting books and relationship guides she had consumed like vitamins during her marriage, but real books, books that had nothing to do with self-improvement, books that were just for her. She started running again, properly, not the punishing runs along the Platte River she had used as a form of emotional regulation during the worst of the affair, but actual runs, runs that felt good, runs that left her feeling strong and capable and inhabiting her own body in a way that had nothing to do with desire or longing or the hunger for someone else's touch. Jonathan filed for divorce in January. Catherine did not contest it. The proceedings were amicable, a word that concealed months of cold fury and logistical warfare conducted through lawyers, a war of attrition over assets and custody, and the many small compromises that constitute a shared life when it comes apart. Jonathan carried the guilt of it with a heaviness that Danielle could see in the set of his shoulders every time the topic arose. He loved his children. He had built a life with Catherine. The fact that that life had been, for both of them, more performance than substance, didn't make the dismantling any easier. There were arguments, real arguments, the kind that left marks. There were days when Danielle looked at Jonathan and couldn't believe her own luck, and days when she looked at him and thought, "What have I done?" There were nights when the sex was extraordinary and nights when it was merely good and nights when they were both too tired and too wrung out from the day's logistics to do anything more than lie side by side and hold hands and listen to each other breathe. There were moments of such profound intimacy that Danielle felt she had been given a glimpse of something sacred, and moments of such crushing mundane reality that she had to remind herself that love, even the best love, even the truest love, was mostly made up of ordinary moments, ordinary days, ordinary choices to stay when leaving would be easier. One night in April, 4 months after she had left Kevin, Danielle sat on the floor of her apartment and cried for an hour. She wasn't sure why. The tears came without warning, without narrative, without any specific grievance she could name. She cried for the life she had lost, for Kevin, who didn't deserve to be left, who had tried in his own limited way, who was now sleeping alone in a house that still smelled like her. She cried for the years she had wasted, the happiness she had foregone, the version of herself she had buried so deep she had forgotten she was there. She cried for her mother, who had died without knowing how unhappy Danielle really was, who had gone to her grave thinking her daughter's life was on track. Jonathan found her there on the floor, mascara streaked, surrounded by takeout containers and unpacked boxes, looking exactly like the mess she felt. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to fix it. He sat down on the floor beside her, leaned his back against the wall, and put his arm around her shoulders. "You don't have to be okay all the time," he said. "I know. I mean it. You don't have to perform happiness for me. You don't have to prove that you made the right choice. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to be a mess." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His shirt was soft against her cheek. Outside, the city hummed with the ordinary sounds of a Thursday night: traffic, a dog barking, someone's television murmuring through the wall. The whole ordinary, miraculous world. "I'm scared," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud. Not "I'm fine" or "I'm okay" or "I'm handling it." Just the truth. "I know," he said. "Me too." They sat on the floor for an hour, not talking, not touching beyond his arm around her shoulders, just being two people who had burned down their lives and were now standing in the ashes trying to figure out what to plant next. Epilogue, the line. It was a year later. October. The aspens in the mountains outside Denver had turned gold, and the city was bracing for its first hard frost. Danielle was sitting on the patio of a restaurant in Boulder, a glass of Malbec in her hand, watching the sun set over the Flatirons. Jonathan was beside her, relaxed in a way she had never seen him in the early days of their arrangement, a man who had shed some invisible weight and was finally standing in his own shape. He had moved into her apartment in Park Hill 4 months ago, and they were talking about buying a house together, something real, something permanent, something that would belong to both of them and signal, to the world and to themselves, that this was not a phase. This was their life. She thought about the night in the KTV room, the kiss, the confusion, the moment everything changed. She thought about the months of lying to herself, constructing elaborate justifications for something that was never, at its core, complicated at all. She had wanted to be loved. She had wanted to feel alive. She had wanted someone to look at her like she was extraordinary, and when Jonathan did, she had tried to pretend it was just sex because the alternative was too frightening to face. She had called herself many things over the past year: fool, coward, cheater, adulteress. She had been called worse by people who didn't know the full story, who saw only the surface of what she had done without understanding the depth of what she had been living through. Her own sister had stopped speaking to her for 3 months. Kevin's mother had looked at her, at the divorce proceeding, with a cold disappointment that Danielle suspected would never fully thaw. But the name that had haunted her most was the one she had refused, the word mistress. The implication of it, of being secondary, of occupying someone's leftover attention, of defining herself by her proximity to someone else's real life, had always felt wrong, reductive, a category that didn't begin to describe the reality of what she and Jonathan had become. She was not his mistress. She was not his side piece or his extramarital convenience or his situationship. She was his partner. His person. The woman he had chosen to fight for when everything in his life told him it was easier to stay quiet and maintain the status quo. The woman who had stood in the rubble of her own life and decided, against all evidence and all good judgment, to build something new. They were not perfect. They had arguments, real arguments, the kind that left marks, and moments of doubt, and days when the weight of what they had done pressed down on them like a physical thing. Jonathan's divorce had been finalized in August, and the guilt he carried for the life he had dismantled, of Catherine, of the family he had promised to be, was a shadow that followed him in ways he couldn't always articulate. There were moments when he would look at Sophie, his new baby daughter, and something would cross his face that Danielle recognized as grief for the father he was not, the husband he could not be, the man he had been before he met her. There were moments when Danielle looked at Lily and felt a terror so profound it stopped her breath, terror that she had destroyed her daughter's life, that Lily would grow up damaged by the upheaval, that the casual confidence with which Lily had accepted the news would curdle, years from now, into anger and betrayal. There were nights when she lay awake next to Jonathan and calculated the odds of their relationship surviving the weight of its own origin story, and the numbers were not good. But there were also mornings. Mornings when she woke up and Jonathan was beside her, still asleep, his face soft and unguarded in the early light, and she got to watch him breathe, and she got to be the person he reached for when he woke up, and she got to be home. Mornings when she dropped Lily at school and her daughter hugged her with a fierce, uncritical love of a child who had not yet learned to judge, and Danielle held her and thought, "This is why. This is what I fought for." Not the grand romance, not the extraordinary passion, but this small, persistent, irreducible love between a mother and her child, and the new intended love between two people who had both been brave enough to want more than they were supposed to have. They were not a fairy tale. They were a second chance, messy, complicated, built on the wreckage of two other lives and carrying all the scars of that difficult birth. There would be no Disney World trip, not yet, not this fall, not with the custody schedule and the new baby and the 100 logistical complications of two people trying to merge their separate catastrophes into one functional household. There would be no fairy tale wedding, not immediately, maybe not ever, because Danielle had learned to be suspicious of fairy tales and Jonathan had learned that the most important things in life couldn't be rushed. There was no guarantee of happily ever after. There was only this, two people who had looked at the wreckage of their lives and chosen, deliberately and with full awareness of the cost, to build something new. Danielle raised her glass. Jonathan raised his. To what? He asked. To not being afraid anymore, she said. He smiled, that smile, the one she had spent a year learning to read, the one that meant something private and specific and entirely theirs. He clinked his glass against hers. The sound was small and bright and clear, like a note struck on a piano, like the first word of a new sentence. To not being afraid anymore. They drank. The sun went down. The city of Boulder lit up below them, a scatter of lights coming on one by one, each window a life, each life a story, each story as complicated and hopeful and irreplaceable as their own. And Danielle O'Brien, who had once told herself she was not in love, who had constructed elaborate fortresses of denial and rationalization and self-protection, who had called herself a fuck buddy because the word beloved was too terrifying to wear, sat in the golden light of the Colorado sunset and let herself, finally, without reservation or apology, be happy. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been in her life. The young woman who had married Kevin believing that love was enough, that passion would sustain itself, that the fire between them would burn forever without tending. The woman in her 30s who had watched that fire die and told herself that contentment was the same as happiness, that safety was the same as fulfillment, that the slow dimming of her own desires was simply what growing up meant. The woman who had walked into a KTV room on a March night and allowed herself to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. And finally, the woman she was now, someone who had burned down her life and rebuilt it from the ashes, someone who had learned that the most terrifying thing was not to want too much, but to want nothing at all. She was not who she thought she would be at 40. She was not living the life she had imagined. But she was alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. She was present in her own body, in her own choices, in the quiet apartment in Park Hill where Jonathan was waiting for her, in the small house they were planning to buy together, in the future that was unfolding in front of her like a road she was finally ready to walk down. She finished her wine. The sky had gone from gold to pink to a deep delve of purple, the first stars appearing over the mountains like small, distant promises. Jonathan took her hand. Ready to go home? He asked. She looked at him, this man who had changed everything, who had seen her at her most vulnerable and most reckless and most human, who had fought for her when fighting was the harder choice. She thought about home. Not a house, not an address, not a mortgage payment or a lease agreement. Home. The place where she was known. The place where she belonged. Yeah, she said. I'm ready. The air was cold and clean, carrying the first hint of winter. A train whistle sounded in the distance, long, low, mournful, like a goodbye to every version of themselves they had left behind. And Danielle O'Brien, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was not afraid of what came next. She was 40 years old and starting over. She had burned down her life and rebuilt it from the ashes. She had found Jonathan and let herself be seen, truly seen, in a way that cracked her open. She was not the woman she had been when she walked into that KTV room in March. She was someone new. Someone who had survived her own choices and emerged stronger. She was ready to live fully, for good, and she was not going back to the life she once knew.